What you're about to see has never happened in front of Buckingham Palace. A US Marine steps directly into a Royal Guard's path and challenges him to a silent standoff. Why didn't the guard move? Not even when the Marine leaned in, whispered in his face, and stared for over 4 minutes straight. This moment nearly crossed the line of royal protocol and turned a light-hearted dare into something no one expected. Watch the Marines salute. And the guard still refuses to blink. What happened right after that left the entire crowd frozen. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It started like a dare wrapped in curiosity. Late morning sun glinted off the black iron gates of Buckingham Palace, bouncing off smartphones and mirrored sunglasses as a small crowd gathered near the forecourt. Tourists leaned on the barricades, cameras in hand, while others fumbled with umbrellas and iced coffees. Behind the rails, 2 royal guards stood in perfect formation, unmoving, unreadable, unmistakably iconic. And that was when the Marine stepped forward. "All right, boys," he said with a low chuckle, unzipping his camo field jacket to reveal the dark olive shirt underneath. "Let's see if this myth holds up." Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole wasn't trying to make a scene. He didn't yell, didn't wave, but the moment he planted his boots directly in front of the nearest guard, squaring up with that sharp American posture, phones began to lift. One person nudged another, then another. A wave of attention rolled through the courtyard. The Royal Guard, Lance Corporal Nathan Trigg, didn't move. He stood like a pillar of Parliament stone, bare-skinned tall, rifle resting against his shoulder, eyes fixed on something far beyond the crowd. But Mason leaned in ever so slightly. "Let's have a look at you," he murmured, just loud enough for the nearby tourists to catch. He didn't sneer, he didn't taunt, but he did stare hard, 2 feet apart now. A decorated US Marine and a ceremonial Coldstream Guard, locked in what began as a light-hearted challenge and was rapidly becoming something else entirely. Mason raised an eyebrow. 4 years as a drill instructor," he said under his breath. "You think standing still is tough, huh?" Still, nothing from Trigg. No twitch, no breath, no shift of weight. The air thickened. A little boy whispered to his mother, "Is he going to move?" The mother hushed him, eyes wide. Even Mason seemed to feel it. The grin on his face didn't fade entirely, but it stopped growing. His eyes narrowed, not in mockery, but calculation. A new thought flickered across his face. This wasn't a tourist stunt. This was something older, sharper. And when he finally spoke again, quieter this time, the words weren't playful anymore. "All right," he said, "let's see who blinks first." Lance Corporal Nathan Trigg had been standing for 41 minutes when the Marine stepped into his line of sight. That alone didn't register. Tourists did it all the time, stepping in close, snapping selfies, trying to break him with giggles or exaggerated salutes. It was noise, expected, background. But there was something about this man's stillness that cut through the usual commotion. Trigg didn't shift, didn't blink, but behind the expressionless exterior was a brain calculating every detail: weight distribution, eye movement, spatial proximity. Years of training had taught him how to hold form under sunstroke, snowfall, and screaming drunks from 3 continents. He had endured worse, far worse. Nathan Trigg had grown up in the quiet corners of Cornwall, where his grandfather had raised him after his mother passed and his father disappeared into a blur of court dates and missed custody visits. His grandfather, Roy Trigg, had been SAS during the Falklands, stoic, firm-handed, and maddeningly precise. But he loved Nathan in the way only ex-soldiers know how, through structure, expectations, and a belief that discipline was the kindest gift you could give a boy without a father. "Stillness," Roy would say while fixing fence posts or ironing his shirts, "isn't passive, it's a form of power. You control the room when you don't flinch." Nathan hadn't understood that as a teenager. He understood it now. He joined the army at 19, infantry first, a good shot, Even better under pressure. He served with pride until a mortar blast outside Sangin cracked open the right side of a convoy and sent Nathan flying through a wall of heat and shrapnel. His left knee never quite healed properly. Didn't need a cane, didn't need surgery, but he couldn't sprint anymore, couldn't pass the speed drills or the burden marches without limping. So they offered him transfer, ceremonial post, Coldstream Guards, Wellington Barracks. Some called it a demotion. He didn't. What the tourists never saw, what they couldn't possibly know, was that ceremonial duty wasn't about looking sharp for postcards. It was about endurance, posture, weight shifting without moving, awareness without reaction. It was discipline, stripped down to its purest wordless form. And Nathan Trigg had always been better at silence than speeches. Behind the motionless gaze was a man who had once held the hand of a dying medic under fire for 3 hours and never let go, even as dust filled his throat and blood soaked into the sleeves of his uniform. He'd learned stillness wasn't about pride, it was about bearing witness, about being the one steady thing in a place where everything else broke apart. So when the Marine's face drifted closer, eyes squinting, tone shifting from play to challenge, Trigg's mind didn't rush. It cleared. He wasn't standing for show. He was standing for everyone who never came home to stand beside him. Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole didn't see himself as disrespectful. He was a Marine to the marrow, born into a military family and raised on discipline, honour, and the unspoken rule that you never cracked under pressure. But he also believed in testing limits. That was how he was raised. First in a Maryland firehouse by a single dad who ran drills in the living room and taped sandbags to his boy's backpack so he'd learn the weight of responsibility. Then later at Camp Pendleton, where pushing limits was just another word for becoming excellent. Mason had served 3 deployments by the time he turned 30. He'd led patrols through Helmand, conducted joint ops in Syria, and trained recruits on both coasts. He was known for his ability to rattle new Marines without raising his voice. He didn't break them through insults, he broke them through silence. Staring contests, stillness drills, mental warfare. You don't win battles by out-yelling the enemy, he used to say in his hoarse parade ground tone. You win by making them blink first. So when he and 2 other off-duty Marines found themselves in London during a post-NATO training leave, Buckingham Palace had been an obvious stop. They were halfway through sightseeing. Phone photos, tourist maps, a couple of pub detours, when someone in the crowd mentioned the legendary unbreakable Royal Guards. They don't blink, a teenager with braces said, holding up his phone. You can scream in their face. They won't move an inch. Mason had chuckled. Not even a blink, he repeated, squinting through the railings. I've got recruits that'd stare down a hurricane before their second cup of coffee. Someone dared him to try it. It didn't take much. The rest of his group hung back, filming with smirks and folded arms. At first, Mason treated it like a drill. Step close, lock eyes, find the fracture point, test the perimeter. He expected nerves, maybe a blink, maybe the faint tick of a jaw muscle or an unconscious twitch in the shoulders. Everyone flinched eventually. The body always betrayed the mind. But this guard, this man, wasn't giving anything back. Not tension, not resistance, not even breath. That's when Mason's internal tempo shifted. This wasn't some well-trained recruit trying to impress a crowd. This was something deeper. The kind of calm that comes from having stood through real storms, not rehearsed ones. His pulse slowed, his stance reset. He'd expected a game. What he found instead was a mirror. And for the first time since he stepped up to the rail, Mason Cole wasn't sure who was testing whom. The silence was starting to spread. It began in the first 2 rows of tourists, those nearest the encounter, who instinctively lowered their voices and slowly stopped fidgeting with their phones. Then it rippled outward in waves, like a change in barometric pressure. A murmur here, a glance there, a hand pausing mid-record. Even the pigeons had stilled. Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole stood directly in front of Lance Corporal Nathan Trigg, no more than 20 inches separating them. Eyes locked, shoulders squared, one man daring, the other enduring. Trigg's jawline was set like quarried stone. His chin slightly lifted, as if gazing past Mason and into something only he could see. His boots hadn't shifted a millimetre since the start of the changing of the guard. His rifle still perfectly vertical, left hand gloved and still, resting against the stock. Mason took a small step closer, intentionally. "You train for stillness," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Nathan to hear. "We train for chaos." No reaction. "3 deployments," Mason added. "Lost count of the standoffs I've won." Nothing. No breath, no twitch of the cheek or brow, just stillness, measured, mature, immovable. Mason tilted his head slightly, changing the angle of the eye contact. He tried what worked on his own recruits: micro disruptions in symmetry, sudden proximity, asymmetrical pacing. He flexed one eyebrow, let one side of his lip curl upward in amusement. Still nothing. He took a deeper breath, let it out slow. "You good in there, mate?" A few people chuckled softly. A pair of American teens whispered, "He's going to crack him. Watch." But the man in front of Mason might as well have been made of iron. He wasn't flexing or squaring off like a tough guy. There was no tension. That's what unsettled Mason the most. It wasn't resistance he was feeling. It was presence. The kind of presence he'd felt only a handful of times in his life. On Overwatch with snipers who hadn't spoken in 3 hours, or standing at Arlington behind a folded flag with an entire battalion watching. It was the kind of stillness that didn't posture or pretend. It just was. Mason's smirk faded. The cameras kept rolling. The crowd grew more reverent. No one was laughing anymore. Someone lowered their phone halfway, as if they realized they were witnessing something no screen could really capture. Mason's pulse picked up. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from awareness. Awareness that this wasn't a stunt anymore. This was a message. The Royal Guard wasn't ignoring him. He was teaching him. A full minute passed, then 2. Mason didn't move. He tried to recall the longest he'd ever stood perfectly still outside of a combat zone, maybe 2 minutes back during his first drill instructor exam. It had nearly broken him. His leg twitched. His back had burned. His eyelids fluttered involuntarily. But this man had been standing before he arrived. He'd watched the changing of the units, the full reset of the line, the slow, rhythmic march of tradition, and he was still locked in place, not as a dare, not as a performance, but as a ritual. Mason finally dropped his gaze, not in defeat, but in understanding. A man who can stand this still in front of strangers has stood much stiller in front of grief. Inside the stillness, Lance Corporal Nathan Trigg wasn't thinking about the Marine's breath or the cameras clicking behind him. His body remained motionless, but his mind drifted, not to distraction, but to memory. He heard the wind over Helmand again, felt the weight of sweat under armour, the hum of tension in the air before everything broke. It was early 2014. His unit had just finished clearing a compound south of Sangin. When the call came in, 2 medics, stranded after an IED, tore through their escort vehicle. The lieutenant hesitated. Backup was 30 minutes out, but Nathan didn't wait. He and 2 others sprinted out into open desert. He could still feel the gravel slipping under his boots, the sound of distant gunfire like nails being tapped on metal. He remembered finding Corporal Lewis, badly burned, legs pinned under the wreckage, one eye swollen shut. The younger man had been babbling, panicking. "I can't feel my feet," Lewis had said. "Trigg, am I going to die?" And Nathan had knelt beside him, pressed his hands into the sand to ground himself, and said calmly, "Not on my watch. Stay with me." They waited for nearly an hour. Sniper fire cracked in the distance. The radio fizzed in and out. At one point, Nathan had to hold pressure on Lewis's femoral artery, using only the weight of his forearm and a twisted rag. He didn't move, didn't shout, didn't flinch, not even when shrapnel struck the nearby ground. Stillness had kept Lewis alive. Stillness had allowed him to listen for enemy movement, to assess their position, to project calm that Lewis could lean on. Even back at barracks, after Lewis was airlifted out and the adrenaline wore off, Nathan had remained in that same quiet posture. He didn't need applause, he didn't need to speak. He just needed to show up again tomorrow and do his duty. That was the first time he realized some men fight with fists, others with silence. Years later, when the Coldstream commander offered him ceremonial duty after his knee failed the mobility test, Nathan had accepted without hesitation. Some called it easier work, but he knew better. Stillness was harder. It asked for restraint when instinct screamed for motion. It demanded poise when pride tempted retaliation. It required remembering, every second of every hour, who and what you were standing for. He looked at the guard one last time, not with challenge, but with something close to reverence, and slowly brought his right hand up into a crisp Marine salute. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't erupt or clap or pull out their phones again. They just stood there. So now, as the Marine inched closer and the weight of the crowd's attention settled like fog on the forecourt, Nathan wasn't thinking about cracking or resisting. He was remembering a boy who survived because he hadn't moved, and that was more than enough to stay still. It happened without ceremony, just a breath. Gunnery Sergeant Mason Cole exhaled through his nose and took half a step back. Not because he was beaten, not because he'd given up, but because he finally understood what was in front of him. He looked at the guard one last time, not with challenge, but with something close to reverence, and slowly brought his right hand up into a crisp Marine salute. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't erupt or clap or pull out their phones again. They just stood there, still, as if the silence now belonged to everyone, not just the man holding it. Mason dropped the salute and turned toward the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't loud, but it carried. "He won't flinch," he said simply. "That's not for show." He walked back toward his friends, who were no longer grinning or holding their phones up. One of them muttered, "What just happened?" Mason didn't answer right away. He looked back once more at the motionless figure behind the gate, uniform sharp, jawline still set, eyes forward as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. "You ever meet someone who says more by saying nothing?" Mason said quietly. "That's him." Near the front of the crowd, an older man in a flat cap, clearly a veteran, offered a slow, deliberate nod toward the guard. His hand hovered near his brow, not quite a salute, not quite a wave, just acknowledgement. The energy in the courtyard had shifted. No more giggles from tourists, no more murmured jokes, just a sense that something deeply respectful had unfolded, something most of them couldn't quite explain, but none of them would forget. At the edge of the palace fence, a uniformed officer approached Mason and spoke without pretense. "Didn't mean any disrespect," Mason said, before the man could open his mouth. The officer glanced at Trigg. "He knows." And with that, the officer walked away. So did Mason. But the image stayed, burned into his mind, like a silhouette on parade, a soldier who said nothing, and somehow spoke volumes. The ceremony ended as it always did, precise, synchronized, timeless. The new guard took position, the band struck its final notes, and the formation pivoted to march. Lance Corporal Nathan Trigg turned on cue, not a beat early, not a beat late. His boots struck the forecourt in perfect rhythm, echoing through the still air. Mason stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just watched the guard who taught him something without uttering a word. As the line passed the iron gate and turned toward the side barracks, Nathan's head remained forward, but his peripheral vision caught the figure waiting just beyond the rope line. Mason took one small step forward, not dramatic, not demanding, just enough to be seen, and then, in a gesture so subtle most of the crowd missed it, Mason gave a quiet nod, one soldier to another. It wasn't about rank or nationality. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding. Nathan didn't stop, didn't turn his head, but just before he passed the edge of the gate, he blinked once. Deliberate, slow, then kept marching. For a Marine who had built a career on testing willpower, it was all the answer Mason needed, and no handshake, no words, just two men with battlefield scars, standing tall in different uniforms, having met in silence and left with respect. If you were standing at that rail in front of Buckingham Palace, would you have stepped forward like the Marine, or stayed back and watched? What's the hardest test of discipline you've ever seen, or lived through yourself? And if you could say one thing to both men in this story, what would it be? Drop your answers in the comments. I read them, and your stories hit harder than you think. If this showdown reminded you that silence isn't weakness, tap like. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Know someone who thinks discipline is just standing still. Share this video with them. Your next Royal Guard story is already on screen. Click and I'll meet you there. See you tomorrow, same time. Bamboo.